You've seen the pyramids, maybe in a photo, maybe in person standing in the heat with a phone raised over your head. And when you looked at them, you may have felt something. That weight, the oldest thing humanity has ever made. The beginning of everything. But the real answer is far stranger. Because when the first pyramid was built, something older was already buried in the ground. Not by centuries, by 6,000 years. A monument so ancient that to the pharaohs it would have been prehistoric and nobody alive knew it was there. Picture a low hill in southeastern Turkey. Dry grass, scattered stones, a lone mulberry tree at the top. For thousands of years, farmers plowed around it and thought nothing of it. But in 1963, a survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University walked right across the top. One of them, an archaeologist named Peter Benedict, noted the broken limestone. He assumed it was an abandoned medieval graveyard. He wrote a short entry and moved on. They were standing on the oldest temple on earth. It took 30 years for anyone to look again. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to the same hill. He had spent years digging Neolithic sites across the region, and he knew what work stone in the wrong place could mean. He studied the shape of the mound. He studied the flakes of flint scattered across it, and he understood, almost at once, what everyone before him had missed. He later said he had two choices that morning: walk away or spend the rest of his life there. He chose the hill. Its name is Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, it means Potbelly Hill. What Schmidt's team pulled out of the ground rewrote the timeline of civilization. Buried under the hill were massive stone pillars. Not rough boulders, but carved, shaped like a giant capital T, some of them over 16 feet tall, each one weighing as much as 10 tons. They stood in great rings, arranged with clear intention, facing inward like figures gathered around a fire. And across their surfaces, cut in relief, were animals. Foxes, boars, snakes and scorpions, vultures with outstretched wings, a single severed leg, a human arm wrapping around a pillar's side, fingers spread across the stone as if the pillar itself were a body standing among the others. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. These pillars were carved around 9,500 BC. That is 11,500 years ago. 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. 7,000 years before Stonehenge. This was built before writing, before the wheel, before pottery, before metal of any kind. The people who raised these stones had nothing but tools of flint and bone. And they had no farms. For a century, archaeology told one story about how civilization began. First, humans learned to farm. Farming created surplus food. Surplus food let people settle in one place. Settlements grew into villages, then towns, then cities. And only then, once people were fed and safe and had time to spare, did they build temples and imagine gods. Religion was the luxury at the end, the dessert after the meal. Göbekli Tepe turned that story upside down. Because the people who built it were hunter-gatherers, nomads. They followed wild herds and gathered wild grain. They did not live under these pillars year-round, and they did not farm a single field. And yet somehow, with no agriculture, no cities, no kings, no writing to coordinate any of it, they organized hundreds of people to quarry, carve, drag, and raise 10-ton stones into rings on a hilltop. How do you feed a workforce like that when nobody farms? Schmidt had a radical answer. Maybe it happened the other way around. Maybe the temple came first. Think about what a project like this actually demands. Somewhere out on the plateau, a slab of limestone had to be cut free of the bedrock using nothing but flint picks and stone hammers. It had to be shaped, carved with animals in fine relief, then dragged, without wheels, without draft animals, without a single rope of woven fiber we can be sure of, across open ground and lifted upright into a ring. One pillar might take dozens of people many weeks, and there were dozens of pillars. You need workers. Workers need food. Feeding hundreds of people gathered in one place for weeks on end means harvesting enormous quantities of wild grain in a single spot, again and again, season after season. And here's where the ground itself gives up a secret. Just a few miles from Göbekli Tepe rises a mountain called Karachadar. In 1997, a geneticist named Manfred Hoyne published a study tracing the DNA of domesticated einkorn wheat, one of the very first crops humanity ever tamed. Its closest wild relatives grow on the slopes of that exact mountain. The birthplace of farming sits within sights of the hill. So Schmidt proposed a stunning reversal. It was not agriculture that made the temple possible. It may have been the temple that made agriculture necessary. The pressure to feed the gathering, the need to keep the grain coming year after year until wild wheat slowly became planted wheat. First the faith, then the field. First the temple, then the farm. His younger colleague, the archaeologist Jens Nottroff, has spent years warning against making the story too neat. The truth is layered, and Göbekli Tepe was used and rebuilt over many centuries. But the core shock survives all the caution. At the very moment humans began to settle down and coax the first seeds from the earth, they were also raising the first monumental architecture on the planet. Belief and agriculture were born as twins. So what were they gathering to believe? That is the question that haunts the site. Nobody knows. There's no writing to tell us, and there never will be. But the carvings lean hard in one direction. The animals of Göbekli Tepe are not the gentle creatures of pastoral scene. They are predators and scavengers, fanged, clawed, venomous, snakes pouring down the stone in tangles, scorpions frozen mid-strike, vultures which in later cultures of the same region were tied to death and the carrying away of the dead. Some of the tallest central pillars are not blank slabs at all. They have arms, they have hands and belts and the faint suggestion of a body. They may have been the oldest depictions of gods or ancestors or something we have no word for that any human ever carved. This was not a monument to a good harvest. It looks like a place built around danger and death, and whatever the builders believed waited on the far side of it. And then, around 8000 BC, they did something almost as strange as building it. They buried it, deliberately, by hand. The rings were packed with rubble, tens of thousands of tons of stone chips and dirt and animal bone, filled in until the entire complex vanished back into the hill. Nobody fully understands why. Maybe the beliefs changed. Maybe a chapter of human life was being closed and sealed on purpose. But that burial is the reason any of it survived. They hid it so completely that it slept, almost perfectly preserved for 10,000 years. Klaus Schmidt dug there for 20 years. He never got to finish. He died suddenly in 2014 with less than a tenth of the site uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are at least 15 more great rings still down there, still buried, still holding their pillars upright in the dark. And Göbekli Tepe was not alone. In the years since, archaeologists, led by Necmi Karul, have uncovered a sister site just over the hills, called Karahan Tepe. The same era, the same T-shaped pillars, the same carved animals, and stranger things besides. Rooms carved directly into bedrock, a row of pillars shaped like human figures. An entire lost world of these sanctuaries, scattered across the hills of southern Turkey, built by people we were once certain could not possibly have built them. A whole civilization of monument makers who left no words behind, only stone. So think again about the pyramids. When the pharaohs raised them, Göbekli Tepe had already been buried and forgotten for 5,000 years. Sit with that. The distance in time between you and Cleopatra is smaller than the distance between Cleopatra and those pillars. To the Egyptians, the builders of that hill were not ancient ancestors. They were a mystery, already lost, buried deeper in the past than the pyramids are buried from you. You were taught that civilization began with farms and cities, and that faith and wonder came afterward, once we finally had the time. The hills say otherwise. It says before we planted a single seed, before we wrote a single word, before we built a single wall to keep the cold out, we climbed a hilltop and raised something enormous towards whatever we believed in. The very first great thing we ever built together was not a home, not a granary, not a fortress. It was a temple. You've seen the pyramids. You thought they were the beginning. But the beginning was a pot-belly hill in Turkey, where hunter-gatherers with tools of flint carved their gods out of 10-ton stones, and then buried them so carefully that they waited 11,000 years for you to remember they were ever there.